And we expect that the audience will drift in and filter in a little bit here as we go, and that's sort of the natural after lunch slot. So what I want to do here real quickly though is take a moment to recognize and thank the people who did all the hard work for this. I think it's important to acknowledge this, and those of you who've attended programs that I've participated in the past know that I like to remind everybody that what you see represents about 10% of the actual work that takes place, and 90% is largely invisible, right? And in fact, intentionally so. In fact, the only time that the invisible parts become visible is when something goes wrong, like when the slides start, right, cycling unintentionally, right? That's the only moment. But that's like a tiny piece of these other kinds of details. So I want to quickly go down through. I'm not going to take a lot of time to do this, but I want to thank Susan Neal, Executive Director of the Gilcrease Museum, President Clancy, Dean Kalpana Misra, for supporting both this symposium and Cultures of the Americas. I want to mention Michael Chaikin and Mark Davidson from the Bob Dylan Archive, Sean Latham, TU Institute for Bob Dylan Studies and Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. Our panel chairs, Jennifer Airy, Danielle Carlotti Smith, Mark Davidson and Sean Latham, Laura Fry and Julia White, Grant Jenkins, Kristen Oertel and Alicia Odewale, and Andrew Wood. All of our panelists as well. Thank University Relations, Mandy Bush, Mona Chamberlain, Greg Carmack, Matt Castile did a lot of the publicity, did all the publicity work. At Gilcrease, HCAR and Special Collections, Mark Dolph, Laura Bryant, Laura Fry, Renee Harvey, Mark Davidson, Mark Carlson, Adrian Alexander, and of course Diana Folsom, who spoke to us at lunch. Carolyn Fouch, Project Manager at HCAR, Lacey Wolfers, Communication Manager, Alex Patterson, Jesse Rice, Carolyn Hill, and Neil Scott, and James Reed over here for managing secure, the guy with his hands on his hips, right? So don't mess with, right? He's the man managing everything. And before I turn things over, and I want to offer special thanks and recognition to Natalie Panther, who handled all the contracting, handled all the paperwork, managed all the details. I'm up here taking credit, but I was like just the big picture guy. And when you identify yourself as the big picture guy, it's really great because then you just sort of say, yeah, and you can kind of take care of all of that stuff, and I'll just think, large, big thoughts, right? So thank you so much, Natalie. How about a round of applause, please? Really great. And so,
thank you so much, Brian. Our next panel is going to be a roundtable discussion on the archaeology and public history of enslaved Africans in the Americas. And before I introduce the panel chair, I'm going to show another quick video about how this topic relates to some of our collections in the Gilcrease Library and Archive. This panel was organized by TU Professor of American History, Kristen Oertel. Kristen Oertel, her research and teaching focuses on the Civil War and Reconstruction, African American history, the history of race and gender in America, and the history of sexuality. Oertel's most recent book, Harriet Tubman, Slavery, the Civil War, and Civil Rights in the 19th Century, chronicles the life of this iconic leader of the Underground Railroad. Please help me welcome Kristen Oertel.
Thanks, Natalie. And I have to acknowledge my co-organizer, Alicia Odewale, as well, who helped organize this panel. It's my pleasure to chair this roundtable discussion, or should I say, straight table discussion, on the archaeology and public history of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Since we want this discussion to be as interactive and dynamic as possible, I will be introducing all 5 of our panelists up front, and then each person will speak for a few minutes about their individual research and group projects. Then I will pose a few questions to the panel as a whole, and after panelists have a chance to address them, I will ask for questions from the audience. We want this to be an organic discussion that we hope will be both enlightening and inspiring. Our first panelist is Ayana Flewellen, who is currently a Ph.D. candidate in anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, where she also received her master's in African and African diaspora studies. Flewellen co-founded the Society of Black Archaeologists, an organization dedicated to increasing the number of professionally trained archaeologists of African descent through the promotion of social responsibility and academic excellence. She currently co-directs the Estate Little Princess Archaeology Field School program, which was recently awarded the Diversity Field School Award from the Society for Historical Archaeology. Her dissertation, which she will defend next month, focuses on sartorial practices of self-making among African American women during the post-emancipation era in Texas. Flewellen will be a University of California at Berkeley President's Postdoctoral Fellow during the 2018-2019 academic year before joining the faculty at Queens College at CUNY as an assistant professor of anthropology. Next, we have Dr. Alexandra Jones, founder and chief executive officer of Archeology in the Community, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that is dedicated to increasing community awareness of the benefits of archaeology and history through public events. Dr. Jones obtained dual Bachelor's of Arts degrees from Howard University in History and Anthropology, a master's degree in History from Howard University, and a Ph.D. in Historical Archaeology from the University of California at Berkeley. She currently teaches people of all ages about archaeology. Dr. Jones worked for PBS's television show Time Team America as the Archaeology Field School Director, where she directed field schools for junior high and high school students at each of the sites for the 2013 season. She is currently an assistant professor at Baltimore City Community College and an adjunct professor at the University of Baltimore. Third, we have Justin Dunnavant, who received his BA from Howard University and his MA and PhD from the University of Florida. Justin is currently a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Santa Cruz. His dissertation research explored the intersection of archaeology, identity, and the politics of representation among the Wolaita of southern Ethiopia. His current research in St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands, investigates the ecology of enslavement in the former Danish West Indies. He has conducted archaeological excavations in Belize, Jamaica, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Gambia. In addition to his archaeological research, Justin is a founding member of the Society of Black Archaeologists. Next is Maria Elizabeth Liz Ibarrola, who is a PhD student in the anthropology department at the University of Florida. Her research interests include ethnogenesis, resistance and rebellion, borderlands, colonial and territorial Florida, as well as community archaeology and engagement. Her current research takes a comparative approach to resistance and cultural change within 18th and 19th century Florida in an effort to place Maroons and Maroonage, often defined by their radical nature, within the spectrum of anti-slavery resistance and everyday African life in the Americas. Liz also teaches race and racism at the University of Florida and has served as a teaching assistant for the UF Historical Archaeology Field School for the past 4 years. Finally, my colleague, Dr. Alicia Odewale, is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Tulsa, where she received her PhD in 2016. She specializes in African diaspora archaeology in the Caribbean and southeastern United States. She has been researching archaeological sites related to Afro-Caribbean heritage on St. Croix since 2014. Her research has received awards from the American Anthropological Association, the National Science Foundation, the Society of Historical Archaeology, and the Minority Doctoral Scholars Program of the Southern Regional Education Board. She is a co-creator of the Estate Little Princess Archaeological Field School under the direction of the founders of the Society of Black Archaeologists, Ayana and Justin. Now each panelist will talk briefly about their current research projects, and then I will pose some questions to generate discussions. Ayana.
So I wanted to start by just giving an opening to the Estate Little Princess project. It's actually what brought all of us on this stage together in a variety of different ways. The Estate Little Princess Field School project is based on a conceptualization of sustainable archaeology that Justin and I are developing that really centers on capacity building amongst the community impacted by our work. So we're really looking to not only expand our research interest in the enslaved village area at the Estate Little Princess, which I should note is an 18th century Danish sugar plantation, but the primary focus of the field school itself and what was awarded by the Society for Historical Archaeology is the youth archaeological training program that we run each field season. The field season is such a delight and enjoyable process, I will say. But one thing that Justin and I came together when we first thought of the Estate Little Princess and wanting to really have a space to train youth to not only be engaged in STEM-filled research on island, but to also provide an opportunity for them to learn opportunities to become their own cultural stewards. We needed someone who did that work. So in acknowledging our capacity among ourselves, we contacted a dear colleague and friend of ours, Dr. Alexandra Jones, who runs international and national-based youth training programs in archaeology as well as teacher training programs throughout the country. So she actually developed our curriculum, which was based off of the science programming in St. Croix, the U.S. Virgin Islands, to really construct a project that not only engaged with cultural resource management and heritage on the island, but fed directly into what the students were learning in their schools. In addition to that, we engaged with a number of community-based programs and organizations on island to include them in this project, not only just at the research development level, but really thinking about ways that they could and we could really develop this project further into the future. So just giving a brief background on the project itself and what brought us all here together.
Okay, that's okay.
Oh, the lights just on. Yeah.
So I'm Dr. Alexandra Jones. I guess to give a little bit of background about research, my research is completely based on community archaeology. And when I think of community archaeology, I literally mean engaging the community in every aspect of the archaeological process. One of the reasons I kind of founded and started my organization about 8 years ago was that marginalized communities oftentimes see archaeologists and hear their stories told to them, but they are not often in that process of creating their own histories and their own stories. And it resonated with me and hit a personal chord that I grew up in a city where the Smithsonian is housed, but I have never seen an archaeologist that looks like me. And so while I was a graduate student, probably the craziest thing you'll ever do is start a nonprofit while writing your dissertation. But I started it in order to stop this cycle, because if you don't stop the cycle and if you don't actually step up and do something, it will continue. Since the founding of my organization, I have partnered with the Institute of Archaeology in Belize, and I've done programs all throughout the districts in Belize with youth, with Belizean archaeologists. So you don't just see me, but you actually see archaeologists from your country, and we're talking about heritage preservation and why preservation is important. I've worked with the customs and the police departments, giving them the same kind of lectures and letting them know that my kids will be coming to you and you should, be there and ready when they come. I've also done programs here in Oklahoma around the same thing. I've done programs with the Zuni Middle School, where I partnered with Zuni archaeologists and had them come in and talk, because it's one thing, again, for an outsider to talk about why your heritage is important. It's another thing for a person who looks like you to talk about it. So I've been very proactive with this idea. I've recently, 2 years, partnered with Mount Pillier in a landscape of conflict. We go to James Madison's home and we look at it and it's beautiful, but it's also a landscape where slavery took place. And so I have those conversations with teachers on how do you teach students about this? How do we discuss this in a way? How do you get them thinking about interpretation in their lives and how this affects us? And with the idea with St. Croix, basically the same thing. Let's talk about this. Why is heritage preservation important? Why is your own island important to you? And getting kids to think about those sort of concepts. So when we talk about public archaeology, I take it a little bit further, and I recognize my limitations as just a woman of color when you're talking to other marginalized groups. So what I do is I partner with other people that look exactly like the groups that I'm talking about. So it's not coming from an outsider, but it's coming from an insider when we talk about what is going on with us, what are our struggles that we're all having, how do we move forward, and how do we become the stewards of our own history, our own heritage, and how do we tell our stories in a way that resonates most with us. So I guess I spend most of my life talking with teachers and students and empowering them in ways that they've never thought about or have been challenged before.
All right, thank you all for coming out. Thank you again for the invitations. My name is Justin Dunnavant again. I'm currently at the University of California in Santa Cruz. I just want to provide a little bit of background about the Society of Black Archaeologists, which myself and Ayana co-founded back in 2011. I was just starting graduate school at the time. Ayana was still an undergrad at the time. And we had just come back from a Society of Black Psychology conference in Florida where we had attended. And we said we need a professional organization like this in archaeology because there's too few of us in the field. And it's one thing to be underrepresented in your field. It's another thing to see a drastic increase in research about your people and in your area of interest without seeing yourself represented. And so we thought it was important to design an organization to address that issue. So we started the organizations mainly with the intention of identifying those who currently existed in the field, doing oral history interviews with them. The first black woman to get a Ph.D. in archaeology in the United States is still alive. She's still teaching at the University of Syracuse, and she got her degree in 1980, just to put that into perspective. So there's this very recent in terms of African Americans getting Ph.D.s and degrees in these fields. And then we wanted to use that as a sort of way to identify best practices that we could use to get more people into the field and to figure out how to make this process a little easier for those coming out and coming up in the future. Some of you who are in the field of archaeology may know that there's a lot of issues around gender and around race in terms of younger people getting their PhDs, being often in secluded sites in these fields with their major advisors. It can lead to a number of different issues where individuals feel isolated or uncomfortable. So part of the reason we created this field school in St. Croix as well was to use that as a sort of training ground that we could have some sort of inclusivity and make people feel accepted and warm and inviting. And it's not an academic power play that we see sometimes in our disciplines and in our fields, but really a learning center where we can foster ideas and exchanges between people. Another part of a reason for starting the SBA was also to advocate on the behalf of African American burial remains and heritage patrimony. I don't know if many of you have heard recently, but I think just last week, Shell Oil Company found over 1,000 enslaved burials in Louisiana. Just to put that into perspective, we're still literally uncovering bodies and still learning about histories that have been erased, in many cases through intentional means, and in some cases unintentional means. So we wanted to provide an outlet or a venue whereby we would have some sort of body to, one, say that this stuff needs to be preserved, but then two, also have an intellectual body that can say we can do the research needed to properly document, to properly recognize these sites and these heritages. And from that, we want to sort of expand that out so we can assist other communities in doing those same sorts of things. So that's sort of the Society of Black Archaeologists. There's about 70 black PhDs currently in the United States. That includes African American, Caribbean, and African. working in the US, and probably about another 70 in graduate school and in professional organizations, National Park Service and so forth. So our organization overall includes a listserv of probably around 180, 200 people. We have people from many different backgrounds that come and contribute to the work that we do, and so we're helpful and grateful for them as well. In terms of my own personal research, I'm interested in this global African diaspora question, in terms of not just what was the enslavement experience like when they came over to the United States, but what were some other experiences like before, during, and after enslavement on the continent of Africa, as well as in the Caribbean, and as many people don't know, the Indian Ocean regions as well. So my initial background research was dealing in some cases with burial sites in DC. I did some Buffalo Soldier work in Texas, and then I'm currently working in the Virgin Islands with these wonderful people. And I also have a background working on the continent of Africa with my dissertation research in Ethiopia. So part of it was trying to understand the impact of enslavement on the continent as well, which I think is grossly overlooked when we look at this whole history. But again, research topics shift, opportunities arise, and from this field school emerged an interest in ecology and the relationship between ecology and enslavement. Many of us are aware of the horrors of slavery and sort of the great economic shifts that it created in terms of the development of modern capitalism and these sort of world trade systems. But we rarely look at the impact it had on landscapes and land and the relationship between the land and the people who occupy the land. So part of the interest is sort of exploring that more in terms of what were these sort of drastic ecological shifts that occurred when you have to clear thousands of lands, thousands of acres for sugar plantations. And what happens when this soil becomes denuded of much of their resources because you've been massively producing these cash crops on this land for so long. What are the issues with runoff? How does it affect coral reefs in some instances, in the case of the Virgin Islands, when you're literally mining coral for housing construction purposes? And again, this stuff happens very rapidly. So it created a number of drastic ecological shifts that we're able to see more clearly in St. Croix because it's such a small, isolated context, but really occurred all throughout the United States, especially along the Mississippi. You'll see a lot of it there. So that's where the research is leading now, and we're hoping to expand that out to get more students involved. I know Alicia's got some students coming into the program here. We hope to recruit some students between us at Santa Cruz and Berkeley, and then also building collaborations with other institutions and other organizations as well. So.
Okay, hi, I'm Liz Ibarrola. So my own work has focused primarily on Maroons in Florida. So Maroons were self-liberated Africans who developed these independent societies. This work kind of has taken a different approach. So I'm looking at transforming the narratives that have become entrenched in the American imagination about what slavery looked like, who slaves were. So rather than prioritizing moments of violence or violent resistance, I want to look at what the everyday actually looked like in people's lives. These moments of making do, the tactics and strategies that people engaged in to make lives in the everyday. And so I'm also in the position, I'm also in the position now to be learning from these wonderful colleagues about how to transfer that academic work where I am, seeking to transform these long-standing narratives within American history so that they can be coming from a more appropriate source. So learning how to take a backseat myself as the archaeologist, to understand where social power comes from, and how I can more appropriately place my work in the hands of the descendants of those people that I study and the communities that I work with. So I also wanted to note for all of you that I am also a community organizer within Gainesville, Florida, working on issues of immigration. So I was really happy to have the opportunity here to maybe explore the intersection between that work and my academic work. So for me, it's very critical that the work that we do as archaeologists not only tells these stories, these narratives that have been somewhat hidden, not only that we are bringing these stories to light, but that also we are tying them to current systems of oppression. You know, capitalism has its roots in the slave trade. You know, we don't want to forget or misplace this history because it has contemporary significance. So that's what I have to say.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Alicia Odewale, and again, I'd like to thank you for being here, but listening to all of us here on this panel. We're happy to be invited to speak to this symposium. For my work, I specialize in comparative analyses of archaeological research, specifically in the African diaspora, as many of us share in that same topic focus. But my work has been primarily in the Caribbean, specifically on St. Croix. And so my dissertation was focused on comparing two different communities. And when I say communities, I specifically focus on communities that fall outside of the traditional scope of narratives of slavery that has happened in the past. So focusing on a community of what was identified as royal slaves that are living in an urban environment in the Caribbean, and comparing that to enslaved communities at Montpelier, as Dr. Alexandra Jones was just mentioning, enslaved people that are serving our nation's 4th president. So taking enslaved peoples that were working with both a king and a president. What does that mean for their lives? So I focused on not only just investigating their life ways, but trying to figure out what are the natural and social challenges that they had to deal with on a daily basis, and using archaeology as a tool to figure out their response, how they respond to those challenges that they're facing and how they overcome them. So in my research and throughout every project that I've taken on past the dissertation, my focus is primarily to highlight both the challenges but also the triumphs, focus on the external stress to the community but also the response from the community. So I really think we need a more complete narrative around these stories of enslavement and freedom, and so that's what I focus on in my research primarily. So within these comparative analyses of communities, that's what led me to partner with Justin and Ayana on the Estate Little Princess Field School. The research and teaching surrounding that site as a rural plantation estate allowed me to bridge a new comparative analysis between an urban slavery environment and a rural plantation environment on the same island of St. Croix. So that was a nice bridge there. And then from that, more comparative work is coming because we just opened a new research lab at the University of Tulsa that I'm directing called the Historical Archaeology and Heritage Studies Laboratory, housed in the anthropology department. And so within that lab, we focus on researching diasporic communities and the archaeology around diasporic communities within African diaspora and beyond. So within that, we focus on not only the historical archaeology, but really the heritage. We focus on genealogy research, documentary sources, a lot of things that are pulling in stories of heritage into our archaeological analysis to further humanize our research. And lastly, we are, as Justin picked up on, we are expanding, bringing in more students and more research, so there's more projects to come. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I just have a few questions to get us started, and then we hope we'll have I know we'll have some great questions from the audience as well. How does archaeology provide tools to discover displaced peoples, people who have been forced to migrate and who don't leave traditional sources behind to tell their story?
I guess I can answer. I think that, thank you for your question.
I was going to say, there's some traditional sources in St. Croix. These are some manuscripts that narrate a slave rebellion in 1848 that initiated the emancipation, or really forced the emancipation process in St. Croix. And then here's the Estate Little Princess that they've all mentioned. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you for that. I think when it comes to especially documentary evidence, there's so many sort of theoretical understandings of coming in contact with people of color within these documents, where quite often we're looking at probate records, we're looking at, you might be looking at planters' records, sugar records, diary entries from white planters who owned these individuals, but not necessarily have the words from people who lived in these spaces. So archaeology provides tools that people used every day, as Liz was mentioning, trying to look at the everyday sort of modalities of being. So it's looking at like plates that people touched to have a conversation about the food that they were eating. It's looking at beads and buckles, which is something that I focus on when I say sartorial practices of self-making, looking at how people dress themselves daily to present themselves and who they were, which might not necessarily be captured in, say, historical photographs from the late 19th century, even though we have these beautiful images. Quite often they were either Sunday best images, or if they were depictions of enslaved individuals, they were often captured for white audiences, often paid for by their white planters. So there are ways that material culture then becomes a really powerful line of evidence used by the people who lived these extraordinary lives and complex lives that talk not only about trauma inflicted, violence inflicted, Black death inflicted, but resilience, making do, being. So that's what I would say.
I was going to say that using archaeology as a tool, when you don't have a lot of the traditional sources of the documentary evidence to lean on, it kind of forces you to do more creative thinking, especially when you're talking about communities that are under stress, communities that are marginalized in diasporic contexts. You can think of a number of different ways that one artifact can be used, the multiplicity of functions that can come from one artifact. And so it forces you to leave behind any kind of bias you might have of why a spoon might be in a certain context, but to rethink the use of a spoon and what that could mean in terms of life ways, in terms of food ways, in terms of what is etched on the spoon, what can the symbol mean. So it can have a number of different functions to one object. And so the archaeology can be used as a tool to get you to a lot of different imaginative diversity of lived experiences that you wouldn't get just from documents.
I just want to touch on something that, Ayana was emphasizing. I think that archaeology, although it is often used in conjunction with historical documents and geophysical testing, and it is one of many tools used by an archaeologist, it gets at the embodied experience, right? Our everyday physical lives, because although we all have ideas and they can be written down on paper, we can, photos of us can be taken, there can be descriptions of the clothing we wear. Those things don't mean much when they are outside of the context of our lives. So, Ayana mentioned buttons. An archaeologist can see the wear on a button. The archaeologist can see the bath of the drips off of the side of a house. In the ground. We can see, how space was used over and over again, how a path was tread through days, months, years. There's something about our physical everyday lives that archaeology is specifically well suited to get at.
What I'll just add to that is that oftentimes what you see with marginalized people, they're omitted from the documentary record. Point blank, depending on who, what, where. But you often have ethnographies, you have oral traditions, you have oral histories. One of the things about archaeology is it's often paired when you're dealing with marginalized people with that. So you already know the stories, you've heard the stories, you've heard how we came to be, where we are, how we utilize things, but when you find evidence of that in the archaeological record, it often makes it a little bit more tangible. It makes it a little bit easier to understand. And it's also one thing that marginalized people have used for years as defense to argue that we do have a history, we do have a heritage, and it's validated through the material objects that we have uncovered, that for years people have tried to tell us this wasn't accurate, this wasn't true, you can't prove it. And so archaeology has been used as a validation tool for a lot of peoples.
Liz actually spoke to the next question, or one of the other questions I had. Why is it important to incorporate both archaeology and history together to tell the story of slavery and forced displacement in the Americas?
Since you started the conversation. Yeah, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So in my own work looking at Maroons, often the archaeology is also wanting. So not only were these individuals, removing themselves from this situation of oppression where their lives might be documented by their oppressors in a biased way, and then fleeing away from the military forces who sought to control them, who also told their story in a particular way. Then the sites that they lived at were ephemeral because they were on the move, because they had to purposefully, unpattern their lives so that they could not be, sought and returned to slavery so easily. So in many cases, you aren't ever going to be able to get a complete story from one source. The archaeology is incomplete. The documentary evidence is incomplete. So we are forced to build these stories out of bits and pieces from different sources, and we find along the way that the result, because we are relying on these different sources, on these different perspectives, on comparison between different sites, that the end result is actually more complete. It's more full than what the story we might have told, the narrative that we might have believed in if we had simply relied on that one source. If it had been easy, then maybe we wouldn't have come up with that answer.
I would add to Liz's point, it really makes you question what it is that you come across. Even when you're in the archives and you uncover a document that's like a bill of sale, a probate record, a diary entry, a photograph. In my cases, I come across these really beautiful stereoscopes, these photographs of enslaved workers, and it really makes you question what exactly it is that you're seeing. It makes you question the motives of who it is that wrote it, who it is that took the picture. It makes you question these lines of evidence, and archaeology does the same as well. I know in my own personal research, doing a lot of historical research on post-emancipation lives in Texas, very nomadic, people were moving, and the sort of dire economic challenges that African Americans faced after emancipation were very real and very concretized. And yet, looking at historical documents or historical evidence that might look at just, say, an economic perspective of how people live their lives, you would have never thought that you'd unearth cloth-covered buttons or fasteners for really delicate silkware. There's all these ways that you could question what it is that you're reading and really envision the very complex negotiations people were making to live their daily lives.
I guess just lastly on my end, I would say that one of the things that pairs nicely with archaeology and history is that the things that become revealed once you uncover things archaeologically. So one of the sites I worked at in DC was the largest African American cemetery after the Civil War, and it's currently located next to the National Zoo, for any of you who've been to Washington, DC. What they don't tell you about it is it's a recreational park now, and there's no signage to denote that it used to be the largest African American cemetery. So when we were when we got involved in the project, because bones were being uncovered as people were playing in this park, they took us in and we did the historical background research on it and began to ask basic questions like, well, why did the cemetery shut down? How large was it? And then we find out, well, the cemetery shut down because they wanted to build a national zoo, and nobody wants to go to a zoo with a cemetery right next door. So they actually wanted to make the cemetery the entrance to the zoo. So they then condemned it and said that they're doing witchcraft on the site and so forth. These are stories that come up that are there. They're readily available in the archives, but they're hidden. And so oftentimes it takes something in the material record to bring it up and to raise that story from the ground. So I think the two often do pair nicely with each other and lead to more developed and more interesting questions when they come together.
I think you've all spoken to this a bit already, but I wonder if you could focus on it a little bit more, how you've used your research to bring this history that is often so hidden into the public sphere.
Okay. I conduct this regularly in a variety of fashions. One of the things, I guess my company is based on, is making archaeology accessible to all in innovative and creative ways. So taking things that we normally wouldn't think about and kind of pulling an archaeological stint on it. So thinking about when meeting with children, how can I get the children to start to come out and bring out ideas? So I'm going to give you this article to read, and this is a site that's located here in your community. Now let's start to have a discussion. And normally I try and find a controversial article that looks at it maybe in a different light that everybody wouldn't necessarily agree on. It also varies my age group. I'm not doing this to pre-K, but normally my high school students. And then I challenge them. Let's think about this documentary record that you read. Who was the person who wrote it? Why did they write it? Who funded it? Where was it published? Okay, what's the ethnicity? What's the background? What's the education of the writer? All right, we got to think about all that before we jump into what the article is about. Now let's look at the article. Look at the community it's talking about. Look at the people it's talking about. How do you think this differs? What do you think? All of these questions I pose to my youth, to my community groups when I do adult programs, to really get you to think about what is this landscape we're talking about? How does the documentary record, how's the archaeological record, how do all of this combine? And where is it, as people who come from different spaces ourselves within the groups, how do you think about it different? And did somebody else's idea or concept or notion change the way that you've now thought about this space? And do you have a different view on it? So just kind of thinking about how all these things play, but making us as people, everyday people, kind of start to think about stuff a little bit differently, because unfortunately the one thing that I realized is that we operate in our own little spheres and our little bubbles, and oftentimes we aren't challenged to think about other things or to even ask ourselves all these questions. We like being spoon-fed. We're kind of a generation that we just see it, it pops up in a quick little tweet, a news feed, and we roll with it. We oftentimes don't question all the information behind it, like who wrote it, who produced it, who financed it, whose agenda is this supporting. And so those are some of the things that I like to do in order to get at the meaning of, or the various meanings of what is taking place, because nothing has one history. It's multitudes. Everybody in this room would have a different interpretation of what happened at this panel if we were to ask a quick 2-minute, what did you see? Everybody would come out with something different, something that resonated, and something that, so it's the same thing, and that's kind of how I approach archaeology and the public, is getting all of us to think that we're multivocal, we're multi-ethnic, we have different positions, and what does those different positions look like, and how do they juxtapose against other people's positions?
Well, I just wanted to also highlight, there's a lot of things you didn't touch on because I know you do a million things, but one of the other things Dr. Jones does, she wrote the curriculum for the field school that we had to actually...
And there's some pictures.
Yeah, for the students. There you go. So she actually, we got the high school science curriculum from St. Croix, and she used that to develop the archaeological curriculum for the students on the field school. In addition to that, she did was it 365 Days of Archaeology? Yeah. Where you have short YouTube videos that highlight individual artifacts that have been recovered from various sites throughout the country. And gives us a short 1-minute introduction into, this is an artifact, this is what it means, this is where it came from. All these things are ways that we can engage people that are in touch with social media today. In other ways, we find as archaeologists, we have to sort of expand beyond that, and that's where community collaborators come in, mainly heavily at this stage, where it's developing interpretation of a site, as well as sustainable forms of representation and interpretation, which in some cases, it could be a walking tour. In other cases, it could be creation of signage. In other cases, it could be just a day of remembrance and a day of commemoration around a particular site or particular event. So those are some ways that we engage. We go beyond just excavating and have to then go into the issue of remembrance and interpretation.
I would also argue that academia sometimes can be a very sort of insular space where you do this work and then you write this and then you're in your office writing, you publish it, you're teaching in a class, and there's really no sort of incentive really within this sort of system to do community engaged work. I think I could say and speak for everyone on this panel when I say that if you are doing archaeology that doesn't somehow engage the public, that isn't for the public, that doesn't somehow recognize that the people that you're talking about in regard to the past are directly connected in some way to individuals that live today, then you aren't doing meaningful work. There's a way in which being able to do this work and being able to make these very concrete ties of how people experience life in the past to how people are disenfranchised today makes that work public at all times. And if that's not a central aspect of your work, then I'm not quite sure what it is you're doing. So.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to note that I have been involved in many different projects that claimed to engage the public in some way. And so sometimes that looked like one public day in a field season of 6 weeks where people could come and visit the site and ask questions. One day, right? And the publications all went to academic places or they're not out yet. And that was, you know, we had a public day. And there are other cases where, you know, I've worked on a site where the community support organization for this state park asked us particularly for signage. So that's what they wanted. So we provided signage. You know, we, from the archaeological perspective, looked back at the history of the site and provided them with this service, essentially, a product. But I think what I have learned from the, amazing field school at Estate Little Princess is that if a project is truly engaging a community, it's already social. You don't have to bring it to the public. It is in the public. It is part of the public. So I think that's what's really unique about the project that y'all created.
And to pick up on that, like other projects that I've worked on, nothing compared to the Estate Little Princess Archaeological Field School, because we're literally focusing on the youth as the main goal of the project, to train up a new generation of young Crucian archaeologists. And to have that as the central focus of the work is different than the usual academic production of archaeological research. And so it's shifting the focus, but also breaking down barriers, because the program's completely free. There's no charge to join and be a participant in our field school, and we're bringing the field school to them. It's in the community, just like Liz was saying, it's part of the community. You don't have to make it be public. So it's really changing the focus, changing the narrative, changing your idea of what public engagement is.
So speaking of the public, what questions do you have?
I don't think can everybody hear me? So my question is, Justin?
Yeah.
Everything that you guys have said is awesome, but I'm of African descent, and I know one of the things that a lot of people don't talk about is actually how, as much as racism is a construct in America, we still have our own form of, I would say, racism that is a result of colonization. And I'm actually from a country that is by the Indian Ocean. And the language I speak, Swahili, even though it's a Bantu African tribe, we literally have artifacts of Portuguese, Arab, Indian that are part of that kind of show that this happened, but a lot of people are not even aware of that history, even Africans themselves. So I'm just curious, like, what has your work produced that you can kind of speak about, and especially for the connection, we're talking about spaces, dislocation, but then we're also talking about and understanding that dislocation and speaking about it, kind of reconnecting spaces that have kind of been raptured. So what is the archaeological work that you've done in Africa that talks about the migration kind of?
For people in the back, could you maybe repeat her question?
Yeah, so if I get it right, sort of what kind of archaeological work have I been engaged in that addresses that issue of dislocation and sort of lack of understanding of the connections between communities of African diaspora, I guess you could say. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, myself and Ayana participated in an archaeological field school back in 2011 in Tanzania, looking at the early development of ironworking in Africa. They had some of the earliest evidence of iron production in the region. For me, I worked in the Gambia, which is, there was a small island called James Island, which a lot of people from the Gambia were exported from and then brought into the United States. And part of that work was trying to understand sort of what were the living conditions like for people before they came and when they were brought over there. Archaeologically, that looks very different. In many cases, we're excavating and looking at Danish products or Dutch products that have remained. So you're looking at pots and ceramics and these sorts of things. When we do find, for me, my main work in Ethiopia was actually exploring this whole issue of slavery and the Indian Ocean slave trade. One of the things I found was lacking was the amount of research done just on the development of kingdoms in Ethiopia, and you can extend that down to Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. There's not very much historical and archaeological work that's been done prior to European entry into these regions. So as a result of that, I had to actually put that project aside and just focus on the development of one specific kingdom. So I think it's very difficult. It's a great question to ask, and it's one that many people want to ask, but there's so much background work that has to be done before we can even ask that it's kind of scary. So many people can give oral histories as to how kingdoms developed and where people originated from and how they migrated across landscapes. Even the development of the Swahili language is very complex. That includes words from Arabic, some minor Portuguese, but it's based on a Bantu grammar. And that in and of itself, from a linguistic perspective, tells you that these are many different people coming into contact, and in some ways can tell you a little bit about power relations if the grammar is Bantu, but then the lexicon becomes Arabic, and in some cases some of the numbers come from Hindi, so then you start to understand issues of exchange and so forth. So I think that's a very critical component that we're still very much lacking in, and I think that's in many ways a carryover of colonial archaeology that's been done in Africa for such a long time. We focused on large structures and large buildings, many of which have been built by the Portuguese, and in the Indian Ocean, some built by the Arabs. But we haven't focused more so on these kingdoms in these regions. So my work was specifically looking at the Walaita in southern Ethiopia. There's about 50 different kingdoms in Ethiopia generally, so that's just the tip of a larger iceberg that I think needs to be uncovered. But once we begin to do that work, then we can go back and say, okay, how were these individual kingdoms impacted as people came in, dealing with slave trade issues, or as people tried to flee to escape slave raiding, as groups came together to sort of coalesce and build resistance movements. These are all questions that we can't ask through archival records, but we have to go back through archaeology to explore. I hope that helped.
Can I add something to that? I just wanted to add, so within archaeology specifically, there was, for a long time there was this belief that, well, African people lost everything. They lost all of their culture when they came to the Americas, that it was totally erased. And it wasn't until the 60s and the 70s that people started looking at, Africanisms or like holdovers, right? Ways that culture persisted and made the jump with people, right? And so within our field, even the idea of culture and how it's transmitted has transformed so much, and it's only today, really, in the last 20 years, 15 years, that people are even considering how individuals carried cultural memories. So I think that the work of people looking at the African diaspora in the Americas and those looking at Africa has been so divided because of that belief, because of that thought for so many years that African cultures disappeared when the people that they belonged to came to the Americas. So I think it's a long time breaking down that belief. Yeah.
So, I think you probably do. Was there another question over here?
No, I'm just wondering if the people in the back can hear you.
I can stand.
Yeah.
I don't usually have any trouble filling the room this size. So, first of all, that was just tremendous and inspiring and creative and just a great panel. I'm just kind of thinking over a lot of the stuff. About a year ago, actually almost a year ago, in this building, we hosted a symposium on community engaged scholarship in Indian country. And we had a number of speakers from this region, but people as far away as Saskatchewan and British Columbia, who were doing community engaged scholarship, and that was, some was archaeology, some was linguistics, and it sort of ran across the disciplinary boundaries. And one of the things that I took from those conversations was this question of power and the sort of power dynamic operating inside and around and outside the academy. And in that context, the power shift or the tension, I don't know, tension is really not the right word, the power shift, we'll stay with that, was really being driven by the communities themselves. And in this case, the nations, right, and through their administrative capacity and things like that, to where research was being changed from academics going to the community with a project and working on it for all kinds of outcomes, right? You can certainly don't have to where the community was going to the scholars and saying, we need X, Y, and Z, here's your job. So it was really beyond sort of another step, right? And where the communities were determining the agenda and the project and essentially hiring the academic researchers to do this kind of work. And so when I, sort of listening to what you're doing, I know the political landscape's different and place to place, but I'm wondering if there's sort of any of that sort of thing taking place as well. That's really, so there's sort of different levels of sort of power that are operating here, right?
I would, so a new development, very, very new development. There's a couple things what I'd like to give you to think about. We're talking about a region that is ravished and just been ravished by two Category 5 hurricanes. So thinking about ideas around migration and displacement from the environment. And now you have it where I went in, literally, we just got back 2 days ago from St. Croix, where I had 15 students last summer. I have 5 that are still on island. 10 have left. And one of the things that has come up from a community member is, and something that's very obvious, we're the Crucian archaeologists, they aren't here. So we're bringing something to the people who have this huge, rich cache, if you want to call it, of archaeology, but nobody there to kind of carry on. So it's the idea that within this community, yeah, we're teaching kids, we're teaching them, if you want to say STEM and everything else, but something that was posed to us is, how does this come full circle? Where do they go with this? So you teach them archaeology and then what? Who carries it on? So this year with the field school, what I have now initiated as of a few days ago is a mentorship program based on a community member saying, we need jobs. So, okay, I'm gonna give my 5 babies a job this summer. So I will pay you. And then I've already, decided, okay, well, the next 15 I have, I'm gonna employ you for the following summer. And I'm looking at partnerships with other community organizations to, one, fill a need they have, but also kind of keep this going. So I think there is a great deal of this is what we would like from you, this is what you're doing, and we're trying to find a way to meet that need. And we aren't I think we've been very good as not only power amongst our group, because it's very rare that you find a group of all academic scholars who are on equal footing and give equal credit to each other, because we have our own. But we're also with that with the community. We have a number of community partners who we check in with and have meetings with and we talk with, and what would you like and what do you want to see? How do you feel? This is what's going on. Let us know. I check in with my students. I do videos with them. What did you like? What did you not like? They told me they didn't like being hot. So this year you're gonna get tense. You know? So I think there is a lot of that on varying levels all through, and I'm mostly speaking to the youth portion, but I mean, literally in every aspect, we meet with our community members and we hear it and we listen. We don't just say, oh, okay, that's nice. We met with you, we met our goal. We say, okay, well, this is what we need to add. This is what we need to think about. And then in addition, how do we fill all these voids in the community and help them to take care of? And it goes beyond just the kids to the university, to working with other scholars. So I think it is done.
I'd like to add something that I've also seen just in general in terms of African diasporic heritage, especially going to UT. UT is based, or UT Austin is based in Austin, Texas. A wonderful city which is not really known for how large the gentrification process, or how impactful the gentrification process has been to displacing African American populations in that city. So something that's developed in Austin are these local groups dedicated to preserving cultural heritage in the area. And they're mainly comprised of people who are not academic scholars in the least bit. They are grandmothers, aunties, they are everyday individuals who want to figure out a way to care for a burial ground near their church that's no longer in use. So they're developing these spaces, getting monies from the city to care for these landscapes, and are employing academics to do the research that they need to get the grants to cover these projects. So there's a way that this sort of flip, as you were mentioning, of resources is taking place throughout the country. And I think a lot of it is garnered around preservation of African burial grounds, which are it's being highlighted now that are becoming displaced. So I've seen that in that case.
Yeah, I was also thinking, as we develop these projects, they expand very rapidly, as Alex can tell you, who's now was a board of the St. Croix Archaeological Society as of last week. She's a board member. We realize that there's certain capacities and certain limits to what we can do. And so we're constantly trying to think of what the next steps are and what they might look like. And in some ways we have to say no to certain things. In other ways, part of it is putting communities in touch with one another. So we presented at the International Association for Caribbean Archaeologists, and we had archaeologists from other Caribbean islands telling us that they wanted to work with us, either to exchange students between St. Croix and, say, Dominica, or another island, or to exchange information on how to put together museum collections or exhibitions based off of some of the stuff that you dig up after, a year or 2 years of field work. So I think part of that is also getting these communities in touch with one another, because a lot of times they have the answers for what they need to do. They normally come to you because they need some type of resource that they don't have access to for a good reason, and then there's an exchange that develops. So I think that's sort of a next level of archaeological work where we step back and play facilitator in some ways.
What, are we out of time, or maybe one more question? Any questions? Go ahead.
I went to a program that was put on by the Episcopal Church and the descendants of the DeWolf family. From the state of Delaware, and he was the largest slave trader in the United States. One of his descendants was there, and one of the descendants of a slave was also there to present that history. And they went all the way back to the Gold Coast to see those caverns where the slaves were held. And when you were talking about the archaeology of it, they went over that also. I thought that was very interesting about it. So do you have any history of that? Have you ever been there to the Gold Coast?
I just flew in from Angola, which is not the Gold Coast, but it's southern, we call it West Central Africa. And part of my reason for being there was to look at the potential of doing more archaeological work there. They just came back through a civil war back in 2002, so it's still, they don't have a whole lot of archaeological infrastructure in place. But there are a number of archaeologists that have worked along the coast. We've actually been talking about trying to connect more closely with Ghana, because the Danes actually had a colony on Ghana as well. They had a Christiansted and Frederiksted, which are the main cities in St. Croix. There's a Christiansborg and Frederiksborg currently in Ghana that the Danes were pulling people from. They also had a number of Danish plantation sites in Ghana. So they weren't just doing plantation work in the Caribbean, they were also building plantations in Africa itself. So I think those are the connections that are beginning to develop now. Some archaeologists have done work in Africa to that extent. To my knowledge, nobody's been able to do work tracing one colonial power's impact across the Atlantic in that manner, but that's something that we hope to do forthcoming. Yeah.
All right, let's give our panelists one more round